Hi everyone, I have something interesting for you today, an update from the archaeologists at Göbekli Tepe. So this is not a peer-reviewed research paper, it's more like a bulletin or an update from the lead archaeologist at the site, Dr. Lee Clare, and it's published on the Deutsche Archaeological Institute website. Now we are familiar with the picture painted by Professor Klaus Schmidt, so he was the lead archaeologist at the site from the time of its discovery in 1995 through to his death in 2015. And he told us that Göbekli Tepe was thought to be a kind of sanctuary, which is why it became popularly known as the world's first temple. And it was thought the site had an entirely cultic purpose, with the animal symbols and the pillars probably representing mythical creatures, or maybe just temple guardians or totemic animals. And the story was that the largest excavated structures, so these are the large circular enclosures, C and D, were the oldest, forming level 3, with the smaller circular enclosures, A and B, being younger and forming level 2 stroke 3. And then these rectangular enclosures further up the hill were thought to be the youngest, forming level 2 proper. And nevertheless, these are all thought to be kinds of temple buildings, probably because they all seem to have central twin pillars, and because no signs of domestic life were found at the time. And it was thought that the site was probably not used year-round, but instead it was only used occasionally for feasting, so it was thought to be a kind of beer hall for feasting on cultic ceremonies. And of course, this was a major surprise to the archaeological world, given the site's age, dating to at least 9500 BC. So that's right at the start of the period where people in this region began the transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer. The first time this has happened anywhere in the world, apparently. So a theory developed that it was religion and not agriculture which brought people together at the origin of civilization. Now, if you know about my work on the site, you'll know that it's almost certain the animal symbols represent constellations, apparently the same or similar to the ones we still use today, and that the motivation for their religion was very likely the Younger Dryas impact event, a major globally destructive cosmic impact. And therefore, the Younger Dryas event seems to have played a role in the origin of civilization in the Fertile Crescent, which makes a lot of sense because of all the symbolism and religions that appear later in East Asia and Egypt, with all their catastrophic tales and imagery and their focus on astronomy. And remember, another curious thing about Göbekli Tepe is that the enclosures seem to have been covered over with lots of rubble and rubbish deliberately, which is an enormous task. And it's only because of this layer of protective rubble that we found the site in such a good state of repair, except for a few central pillars of enclosure C, which seem to have been toppled and broken. But some other archaeologists had different ideas about the function of the site, including Banning in this paper, who said a domestic function, in other words, homes at Göbekli Tepe, shouldn't be ruled out. He even thought the large circular enclosures might be houses. Well, it's all change, apparently. New excavations and new finds from the site have changed the story considerably. The new story now of Göbekli Tepe's function is that it is a settlement after all. So in a sense, Banning is partially vindicated. However, the large circular enclosures are still called special buildings by Dr. Clare, so they can still be thought of as temples. But all these rectangular buildings around them, the so-called level 2 enclosures that were also thought to be temples, well, they are now just houses. In fact, these are just the ones we can see on the surface. The youngest ones, because the site itself is very deep, so maybe that's 10 meters or so of houses, were built around the circular enclosures that we can still consider to be temples. So these houses were piled high upon other houses, just like we see at Çatalhöyük, forming what is called a tell. What has led to this change in thinking? Well, the archaeologists made some deeper excavations into this area to make the foundations for a new roofed structure. And they found signs of domestic life, like food preparation vessels for cereals and beer, for example. And finally, they found some hearths or cooking fires. So it looks like food was prepared here. And they also found some stone channels, thought to be for collecting and directing water to stone cisterns for storage. So the people who lived here likely relied on rainwater collection and water storage. And finally, they have found a burial with 3 bodies. So details are still sketchy, but yes, people are buried here under the floors of houses, just as we see at later Çatalhöyük. And finally, there's a good story for why the enclosures, the temples, were buried. Apparently, the temples were surrounded by layer upon layer of houses, each built on the last. So a house might last 100 years before another one is built on top of it. But the temples seem to be many hundreds, if not 1,000 years old, and were never built over. So over time, the houses built up and up around the temples until they were actually on a much higher level. And then eventually, perhaps due to a very strong downpour or a storm, the archaeologists suggest the houses around the temples simply slid into the enclosures, burying them in rubble. Now, this explains a lot, which is a sign of a good theory. It explains why the rubble fills the temples. It explains why the fill has a wide variety of radiocarbon ages, because several building levels would have collapsed all at once into the enclosures. And it also explains why the pillars in enclosure C were toppled and broken. So it's a nice idea, but it does also leave some questions. Were the houses really built up so high and close all around the temples that they could just slide in from each direction? Or did the temples still have a clear view to the south? And surely if that's how the temples were buried, it would leave a kind of dimple in the level of the ground today. And is that how the site looked before excavation? And what could really have caused these landslides to happen? And when? Indeed, is this why Göbekli Tepe was abandoned? Or did the landslides occur afterwards, perhaps thousands of years afterwards? So there's still a lot left to be answered, but it does look like a nice idea that explains a lot. Now, as a consequence of this, is that we can no longer be sure of the age of the temples. All their radiocarbon dates, except one, were based on the fill, which, as we've just seen, will generally be much younger than the temples themselves. So Schmidt's original division of the temples into different time periods has to be rethought. We only have one reliable radiocarbon date remaining, which is from the wall of a temple, enclosure D, and that's around 9,500 BC, to within a few hundred years. But remember, some of the pillars, like pillar 43 here, are embedded into this wall, obscuring lovely artwork. So it's reasonable to suppose that some of the pillars might be a lot older than this date. And of course, that has consequences for theories based on the astronomical orientation of the enclosures, or at least their central pillars, as these assumed the ages of the temples were accurately known. Well, they're not anymore. So all those orientation-based theories, like the temples were oriented to Sirius or the Northern Pole Star, well, they'll have to be rethought. And we still don't know for sure if the temples had roofs. Maybe they did. It doesn't really matter anyway, except that it would limit their use as stellar observatories, but it doesn't affect the interpretation of Göbekli Tepe's symbolism. And it's also thought that some of the pillars were moved, and therefore not all of them are in their original place. Now, no details have ever been given for which pillar was moved where, but that does make a lot of sense for pillar 43, which, as we've seen, is partially covered by the enclosure wall. Now, even though the archaeologists don't tell us which pillars they think have moved or from where, it might be that some of them were once at enclosure E, which is what you're looking at now, at the front of the site. So this is the first enclosure you see when you visit Göbekli Tepe. It seems to have been stripped bare and abandoned. All we have left of this enclosure, if indeed it was an enclosure at all, is this smooth circle of bedrock with two slots for the two central pillars, and these deep stone troughs, which were presumably for water storage. So it's fairly clear that at one time this was a temple structure, but we don't know if or how it was enclosed. Of course, there are no pillars here now. So does that mean this temple is older than enclosure D? Is this one of the original temples that was dismantled and its pillars moved to form one of the temples that we know, A to D? Well, it's obviously speculation, but maybe it's this kind of empty structure that leads the archaeologists to say that some of the pillars have likely been moved, in which case this enclosure could be much older than 9500 BC, right? In fact, this temple might be one of the first ones to have been built soon after the Younger Dryas event. But we'll have to wait and see if the archaeologists can give us more details, especially radiocarbon dates for this particular temple. Anyway, that's it. It seems like Karahan Tepe, discovered recently only 40 miles away, which is now being excavated, that Göbekli was actually a settlement. It had houses, which sometimes seem to have had their own shrines, that's the twin pillars, which were built around separate, much larger temples. And there are good reasons to think the site is much older than the only reliable radiocarbon date we have for any of the temples, 9500 BC. And to be clear, none of this new evidence changes anything about our interpretation of the symbolism. So the theory that the Younger Dryas event sparked a new religion, which in turn motivated the construction of settlements like Göbekli Tepe, which in turn led to the origin of civilization, well, that's still valid. Okay, take care, everyone.